68 years on this earth, and I can tell when a room doesn't want me. It's in the stares that linger like a bad aftertaste, the whispers that drop to a hush when I step through the door. I learned that language long ago, back when I was one of the first black women to pin an FBI badge to my chest. Knowing it doesn't dull the sting, though. That late afternoon in Willow Creek, as I pushed open the glass door of Mabel's diner, I felt that old, familiar weight settle over me. But I straightened my spine, adjusted the silver eagle pin on my blazer, and walked in anyway, chasing nothing more than a quiet meal to fuel me for the road ahead. Mabel's diner was pure small-town America. Checkered tablecloths, the greasy scent of fried onions mingling with burnt coffee, and a jukebox crooning a classic rock tune that took me back to my younger days. The place buzzed with life, families digging into burgers, truckers hunched over pie, retirees sipping coffee like it was their job. I picked a corner booth, its red upholstery faded but clean, and settled in, my scarred hands resting on the table. My fingers, calloused from years of work and trembling just a touch now, traced the edge of the laminated menu. I was headed to a veterans hospital, where I volunteer to hear stories that echo my own, tales of sacrifice, resilience, and battles fought long after the war. But first, I needed a coffee, black, and a grilled chicken salad. Simple pleasures, hard-earned after a lifetime of service. The waitress, Jenny, was young, barely out of her teens, with a crooked name tag and a ponytail that swung like she was counting down the minutes to her break. I raised a hand, offering a smile. "Coffee, black, and the grilled chicken salad, please," I said, my voice soft but clear, honed from years of speaking to be heard without making a scene. She barely glanced at me, scribbling on her pad. "Yeah, sure," she muttered, already turning away, like I was just another order to check off. I kept my smile, though. I've smiled through worse, far worse. Across the diner, 3 guys at the counter were making enough noise to drown out the jukebox. Work boots, flannel shirts, faces red from a long day. Or maybe a few too many beers. The stocky one, with a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks, locked eyes with me first. Rick, I'd learn his name later, but right then, he was just a guy whose stare hit me like I'd crashed his private party. "Check her out," he said, loud enough to carry, nudging his buddy, a lanky guy with a smirk that screamed trouble. "Sitting there like she's the queen of the place. Bet she's lost." His friend, Carl, as it turned out, let out a laugh that scraped my nerves raw. "Probably wandered in from the city, thinking this is some 5-star joint," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The third guy, quieter, shook his head but didn't rein them in. I kept my eyes on the menu, my fingers still, but my heart tightened. I've faced down worse than loudmouths in a diner, folks with real power, real threats, but there's a sharp pain in being mocked just for being you. Still, I stayed calm, my face a mask. There's a power in that, one I learned long ago. Jenny swung back with my coffee, plopping the mug down so carelessly a few drops splashed onto the table. "Salad's coming," she said, half turned away, like serving me was a chore. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, though I couldn't help a wry thought. For a diner, they sure don't sweat the service. I took a sip, lukewarm, bitter as a bad memory. But I drank it anyway. I've swallowed worse in my time, in places far less forgiving than this. Rick wasn't letting up. His voice cut through the diner's hum, loud and deliberate, like he was putting on a show. "Hey lady, you sure you're in the right spot? This ain't no soul food spot." Carl's cackle rang out, and a few heads turned. Some smirking, others looking away fast, like they didn't want to get caught staring. The manager, Greg, stood behind the counter, wiping it down like it was his life's calling, his eyes flicking our way but staying rooted. No help there. I know that type, folks who'd rather let trouble simmer than stir the pot themselves. I set my coffee down, slow and careful, and met Rick's gaze. "I'm just here for a meal, sir," I said, my tone even, but there was steel beneath it, forged in years of standing my ground. "Same as you." My words were polite, but they carried a challenge, one Rick didn't expect. His smirk flickered, just for a heartbeat, but he bounced back, scoffing. "Oh, she's got a mouth on her," he said, elbowing Carl. "Thinks she's somebody important." Somebody important. The words landed heavy, laced with mockery. I've been called worse, but there's a bitter twist in hearing it now, after everything I've done. Cases cracked, lives saved, barriers broken. My fingers brushed the eagle pin, a reflex from my bureau days, when it reminded me who I was, no matter what anyone said. Jenny passed by again, her tray loaded, and muttered, "Just eat and stop stirring things up." I wasn't sure if she meant me or them, but the jab stung all the same. I could have snapped back, but I held my tongue. There's a quiet humor in staying above the fray, in knowing they're picking a fight they don't understand. The diner's vibe shifted, the clatter of plates and chatter sharpening with tension. A nurse, a family nearby, Mom, Dad, 2 kids, squirmed in their seats. The mom's eyes met mine, soft with something like sympathy, but she stayed quiet. Her husband kept his head down, stabbing at his fries. I've seen that before. Folks who sense the wrong but won't speak up, hoping it'll pass. The jukebox flipped to a new track, too cheery for the storm brewing around me. The elderly couple in the corner watched, their faces tight, like they'd seen this story play out too many times. Rick wasn't done. He stood, stretching like he wanted every eye on him, and swaggered over to my booth, his boots thumping loud on the linoleum. "Listen," he said, leaning on my table, his voice low and mean. "This place is for locals, folks who belong. You sure you didn't miss your turn somewhere?" His breath carried a faint whiff of beer, his eyes daring me to push back, like he thought he could scare me off. I met his stare, my heart steady, though a fire was kindling in my chest. "I'm right where I need to be," I said, my voice calm but unyielding, the way I used to speak when facing down bigger threats than him. There's a strength in holding your ground, in not giving them the reaction they're fishing for. Rick blinked, caught off guard, but his smirk crept back. "Yeah, right," he said, turning to his buddies. "She thinks she's tough." Carl piped up from the counter. "Come on, Rick, she's not worth the hassle." But his tone was all amusement, no sincerity, egging his friend on. Jenny dropped my salad in front of me, the plate clattering. The chicken overcooked and the lettuce limp. "Here," she said, her voice sharp. I thanked her anyway, picking up my fork, though my appetite had long vanished. I couldn't help a dry thought. If this is their best, no wonder the place feels stuck in time. Outside, the sun was dipping low, painting long shadows across the parking lot. A black SUV sat near the entrance, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. I'd noticed it when I pulled in, but it hadn't seemed important then. Now, with Rick hovering near my booth, his presence like a dark cloud, I felt the weight of every stare in the diner. They were watching, waiting, but nobody stepped up. I've been here before, alone in a crowd, my dignity my only shield. But I've never backed down, and I wasn't about to start now. The air in Mabel's diner crackled like the moment before lightning strikes. I sat in my corner booth, the red upholstery groaning under me, my salad a pathetic heap of wilted lettuce and overcooked chicken that hadn't seen better days. The coffee, stone cold in its chipped mug, mocked me, daring me to take another sip. In my 68 years, I've faced worse than lousy service, interrogations that stretched into dawn, stakeouts where one wrong blink could have ended me. But there's a raw ache in being treated like you're invisible, like your very existence is a problem. My fingers grazed the silver eagle pin on my blazer, a quiet reminder of who I am, even if this diner's crowd didn't give a hoot. Rick, the stocky guy with a beard that looked like it was staging a rebellion, was back at the counter, but his eyes kept locking onto me, his smirk a challenge I hadn't signed up for. His buddy Carl, all lanky limbs and loudmouth energy, leaned in, their laughter grinding against the jukebox's soft country tune like nails on a chalkboard. "Bet she's still waiting for the red carpet," Carl said, his voice booming across the room, fishing for laughs. A few patrons snickered, their heads ducking too fast, like they were embarrassed to be caught. I kept my gaze on my plate, but inside, my chest tightened. That old fire flickering. I've learned to keep it under wraps, but it's always there, smoldering. Greg, the manager, was still polishing the counter, his rag moving in slow, pointless circles, like he was auditioning for a cleaning commercial. I caught him glancing my way, his face a mix of unease and something sharper. Guilt, maybe? Or just irritation. He'd muttered something to Rick earlier, something that set off a louder laugh, and now he stood there, letting the tension fester. I've seen his type before, folks who'd rather watch a fire spread than grab a bucket. It's a spinelessness that wears a manager's badge as comfortably as a tailored suit. Jenny, the waitress, zipped past with a tray of plates, her ponytail bouncing like she was racing the clock to get out of here. As she passed my booth, she tossed out, "Some folks just don't know when to quit." Her words were half mumbled, but the sharp glance she shot me said I was the target. I've been called worse than trouble in my day, but the casual jab hit hard. I took a slow breath, my hand steady on the table. "Thank you for the salad," I said, my voice calm, though a wry chuckle bubbled in my thoughts. Thanking her for a meal that looked like it lost a fight with the grill. There's a dark humor in that, the kind you pick up when life's taught you to laugh at the absurd. The diner's buzz shifted, the clink of dishes slowing as eyes drifted my way. A family nearby, mom, dad, 2 kids, squirmed in their seats, the mom's gaze soft with something like pity, but she kept quiet. Her husband stayed glued to his plate, his fork scraping like he was digging for answers in his mashed potatoes. I know that silence, folks who see the wrong, but hope it'll blow over if they don't look up. The elderly couple in the corner, their faces etched with years, watched with tight lips, like they'd seen this scene play out too many times. The trucker at the counter, his pie half gone, glanced up, but stayed put. I was on my own, just like I'd been in tougher spots, my dignity the only thing keeping me grounded. Rick stood again, his boots thumping on the linoleum, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He swaggered over to my booth, his presence heavy, like a storm rolling in. "You're making people uncomfortable," he said, his voice loud enough to hush the chatter. "Sitting there all quiet, acting like you're better than us. Why don't you do us all a favor and hit the road?" His words were a dare, his eyes hard, his breath carrying a faint whiff of beer that made me lean back just a fraction. I looked up, meeting his gaze, my heart steady despite the heat flaring in my chest. "I'm just eating my meal," I said, my voice low but firm, the way I used to talk down men who thought they could scare me. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me do that in peace." There's a strength in staying cool, in not giving them the fight they're itching for. Rick's smirk wavered, his eyes narrowing. But he leaned closer, his hand planting on my table. "You gonna talk to me like that?" he growled. "You think you can just stroll in here and act like you belong?" The diner went quieter, the jukebox's ballad fading into a soft hum. The mom at the nearby table gripped her daughter's hand, her eyes wide with worry. Her husband muttered something, urging her to stay out of it. The elderly couple swapped a glance, the woman's lips pressing thin, but they didn't speak. Greg finally looked up, rag in hand, but he stayed frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. I felt every stare, the room waiting to see if I'd crack. Jenny, by the counter, crossed her arms and let out a scoff. "She's causing a scene," she said to Greg, loud enough for me to hear, "hon. Maybe you should do something." Greg hesitated, then stepped out from behind the counter, his posture stiff, his voice low but edged. "Ma'am," he said, looking at me, "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. We don't want any trouble here." Trouble. The word hit like a slap. I've faced real trouble, the kind that leaves scars on your hands and haunts your dreams. And this wasn't it. But the unfairness of it burned, a slow, steady flame. "Trouble?" I repeated, my voice soft but sharp, cutting through the silence. "I ordered a meal. I paid for it. I'm sitting here quietly. If anyone's causing trouble, it's not me." My words were measured, but inside, I was wrestling with myself. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let this slide, but the part that carried a badge for decades refused to budge. Greg's face flushed, caught between his authority and my defiance. Rick pounced, leaning closer. "See? She's got an attitude," he said, his voice booming, playing to the crowd. "Told you she doesn't belong here." Carl joined him now, his lanky frame adding to the pressure bearing down on me. "Come on, old lady," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just go." The word old was a sneer, and it stung more than I'd admit. Not because it was true, but because it was meant to shrink me. The family nearby stood, the mom pulling her kids toward the door, her husband trailing behind, avoiding my eyes. The trucker's fork hovered over his pie, his gaze on me, but he didn't speak. The elderly couple's silence felt heavier, like they were bracing for something. I touched my eagle pin, my fingers lingering on its cool metal. "I've seen worse than this," I whispered. More to myself than them. "Far worse." Rick laughed, mistaking my quiet for surrender. "What? You gonna spin some war stories now?" he said, turning to the room, his voice loud enough to echo. "She thinks she's a hero." The laughter that followed was thin, nervous, but it fueled him. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're nobody here, lady. Nobody." That word, nobody, cut deep, but I've heard it before. From mouths that thought they could define me. I've outlasted them all. The jukebox faded, the diner's silence absolute. Greg shifted, glancing at Jenny, who nodded like she was calling the shots. "Ma'am," he said, his voice harder now, "I'm not asking again. Leave, or I'll call someone to make you." I looked at him, then out the window, where the black SUV still sat. A quiet mystery in the lot. The man in the suit was gone, but that vehicle tugged at my old instincts, a detail I couldn't shake. "Call whoever you want," I said, my voice calm but heavy with a strength I hadn't tapped in years. "I'm not moving." Rick's scowl deepened, his mouth opening to fire back, but a loud bang cut him off, the diner's door slamming open. A woman in her 30s, sharp in a blazer and jeans, strode in, her eyes sweeping the room like she owned it. She carried a leather satchel, her posture all business, and when her gaze met mine, I saw a spark. Maybe recognition, maybe just the kind of grit I used to carry. "Who's in charge here?" she asked, her voice slicing through the silence like a knife. Greg straightened, Rick and Carl froze, and I sat still, my fork in hand, a faint smile creeping onto my lips. I've been through enough storms to know when the tide's about to turn. The silence in Mabel's diner was thick, like the hush before a judge drops the gavel. I sat in my corner booth, my hand steady on the table, the wilted salad and cold coffee long forgotten. The silver eagle pin on my blazer glinted under the diner's dim lights, a quiet tie to a life I'd lived, one nobody in this room had a clue about, or so I thought. The jukebox spun a low blues tune, its soulful notes threading through the tension, like it knew the storm was about to break wide open. That woman who'd just stormed in, sharp in her blazer, eyes slicing through the room like she could read every heart in it, stood by the door, her question still echoing. "Who's in charge here?" Greg, the manager, shuffled forward, his rag dangling from his hand like a white flag. "That'd be me," he said, his voice cracking, eyes darting between the woman and me like a kid caught in a lie. Rick and Carl, still hovering near my booth, shifted on their feet, their earlier swagger wilting under her stare. Jenny, the waitress, stood frozen by the counter, her arms dropping, her face a mix of defiance and doubt. I stayed put, my fork resting on the plate, my heart steady but burning with a fire I hadn't tapped in years. I've faced worse than this, folks with more than sharp words to throw. But the sting of being judged, dismissed, cuts deeper than I'd ever admit. The woman in the blazer strode forward, her boots clicking on the linoleum, her leather satchel swinging with purpose. She stopped a few feet from my booth, her eyes locking onto mine, and I saw something in them. Respect, maybe, or a spark of recognition. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firm but warm. "You okay?" I looked up, a faint smile tugging at my lips. There's a quiet humor in being asked if you're okay when you've lived the life I have. Decades carrying a badge, staring down threats most folks can't even dream up. "I'm fine," I said, my voice calm, the way I used to talk to diffuse a room on the edge. "Just trying to enjoy my meal." Simple words, but they carried weight, and I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Outside, the mom who'd left with her kids was back, pressing against the glass door, her little ones clutching her hands, their eyes wide with curiosity. Rick broke the moment with a snort. "Enjoy your meal?" he mocked, stepping closer, his voice loud enough to pull every eye in the room. "You've been nothing but trouble since you walked in." He spun toward the woman, his bravado flaring like a cheap firecracker. "And who are you, her lawyer? This ain't your business." His words were bold, but his eyes flickered, like he'd just stepped onto a tightrope and wasn't sure he could balance. The woman didn't blink. She reached into her satchel, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a leather case. When she flipped it open, the badge inside flashed like a spotlight in the diner's glow. "Special Agent Laura Carter, FBI," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a razor. The words landed like a thunderbolt, shutting Rick's mouth mid-breath. Carl's smirk vanished, his lanky frame shrinking back like he wanted to melt into the floor. Greg's face went ghost white, his rag slipping from his hand to the ground. Jenny's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with something close to panic. The diner erupted in whispers, patrons leaning toward each other, their faces a mix of shock and awe. The trucker at the counter set his fork down, his eyes glued to me. The elderly couple in the corner, quiet through it all, nodded to each other, the woman's face softening like she'd sensed this was coming. I stayed still, my hands on the table, my smile faint but steady. There's a dry humor in watching folks realize they've misjudged you, like they bet on the wrong team and just saw the score. Laura turned to Greg, her badge still gleaming. "I was outside when I saw what was going down," she said, her tone all business but edged with steel. "Care to explain why this woman's being harassed just for eating her meal?" Her words were a challenge, and Greg stammered, his hands scrambling for the rag that wasn't there. "It's just a misunderstanding," he mumbled, his voice barely holding together. "She was causing a scene, and I was trying to keep things calm." "A scene?" I said, my voice soft but carrying across the room like a whip crack. I stood, slow and deliberate, my blazer falling smooth as I rose, the eagle pin catching the light. I ordered a coffee and a salad. I spoke politely. I paid my bill. I paused, my eyes locking onto Greg's, then Rick's, then Carl's, holding each one like I was weighing their souls. The only scene here was caused by folks who decided I didn't belong before they even asked my name. My words were calm, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Years of proving myself, standing tall when the world wanted me to bow. The room went dead silent, my words hanging like a verdict. The mom outside pressed closer to the glass, her eyes shining. The trucker gave a slow nod, a quiet sign of respect. Laura's face softened, but her voice stayed firm as she turned to Greg. "Sounds like you've got some explaining to do," she said. "And you," she added, pinning Rick with a look, "step away from her table, now." Rick's face burned red, his jaw tight, but the weight of Laura's badge, and the authority behind it, pushed him back. He muttered something under his breath, his swagger crumbling like stale bread. Carl shuffled off, nearly tripping over a stool, his earlier taunts a distant memory. The third guy in their crew, who'd stayed quiet, slipped out the door, head down like he wanted no part of this. I watched it all, my heart steady, though inside I felt that old tug. Part of me wanted to let this go, to walk away, but the part that carried a badge for decades demanded I hold my ground. Laura turned to me, her tone easing. "Ma'am, I'd like to hear your side," she said, "if you're up for it." I nodded, my voice steady, carrying the rhythm of someone who's told hard truths before. "I came here for a quiet meal," I started, my eyes sweeping the room, meeting every gaze that dared to meet mine. I've walked into places like this my whole life, places where my skin, my age, my stillness made me a target. But I've never let that stop me from living with dignity. I didn't come here to stir things up, but I won't be shoved out either. My words were simple, but they carried every case I'd cracked, every moment I'd stood firm when the world tried to break me. The diner was silent, every eye on me. Laura listened, her face a mix of respect and steel. When I finished, she turned to Greg, her voice like iron. "This woman has every right to be here. Your failure to step in, and your staff's role in this, let this harassment happen. You'd better rethink how you run this place." Greg's face was a mask of shame, his eyes flicking to Jenny, who looked away, her earlier attitude gone. "I'm sorry," he stammered, facing me, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at him, my gaze softening but not letting him off the hook. "Intentions don't undo actions," I said quietly, a lesson I'd learned the hard way. "But I hear you." I reached into my blazer, pulling out a worn photo, a snapshot from my bureau days, me in a suit, standing with colleagues long retired. I held it for a moment, then slipped it back. Laura caught the move, and a spark of recognition passed between us. The door swung open again, and the man in the dark suit from the SUV stepped in. Older, gray at the temples, his posture ramrod straight like a soldier, he handed Laura a folder without a word. She glanced at it, then at me, her expression shifting to quiet awe. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low with respect, "I didn't know who you were." She turned to the room, her badge shining. "This isn't just any customer. This is Eleanor Brooks, a retired FBI agent, one of the first black women in the Bureau's field ops. She's put her life on the line for this country more times than we could count." The room gasped, the truth hitting like a shockwave. Rick's face drained of color, his mouth flapping like a fish out of water. Carl stumbled back, knocking over a stool, his hands fumbling. Jenny's eyes welled up, her hands covering her mouth. The trucker stood, pulling off his cap in a gesture of respect that hit me deep. The elderly couple started clapping, slow at first, then joined by others until the diner rang with applause, a sound that eased the ache in my chest. I stood still, my face calm, but inside, a quiet pride swelled. I hadn't chased this moment, but I owned it, the way I'd owned every hard-won win in my life. Laura stepped closer, her voice low. "Agent Brooks, it's an honor," she said. "Anything I can do?" "Nothing needed," I said, my smile warm but firm. "I just wanted my coffee and salad." I paused, then added with a wry twist, "Though I'd appreciate it if this place figured out how to treat folks right, starting with the coffee." A few patrons chuckled, the tension cracking just a bit. Laura nodded, turning to Greg. "You heard her," she said, handing him a card. "I'll be checking in." Greg took it, his hands trembling, his face pure regret. I gathered my things, leaving a tip despite the sorry service. Old habits die hard. I walked toward the door, my steps steady, my head high. The patrons watched, their silence now one of respect. Rick and Carl slunk back to their seats, heads bowed, their laughter a distant memory. Jenny stood frozen, tears streaking her face. As Greg muttered another apology, I acknowledged with a nod. The man in the suit held the door. "Agent Brooks," he said, quietly, his voice heavy with respect. I nodded back, stepping into the evening air, the black SUV waiting, its engine a soft hum. I didn't look back as I walked away, the setting sun warm on my face, my heart steady with the knowledge I'd held my ground, same as always.